In this video, we'll discuss the suitability of the next generation Ford Ranger for use as an overland vehicle. Although I've previously owned two Toyota Hiluxes in succession, that was quite some time ago, so it would not be fair to compare them to the current generation Ford Ranger. I will, however, compare it to the previous generation Ford Ranger, and more specifically the pre-facelift 2015 XLT version, which I owned since new. That vehicle saw very hard use in the Namib, in the Kahuku in Namibia, in the central Kalahari, Moremi, Savuti, and in Zimbabwe, and it never let us down, so we were quite impressed with it at the end. In later videos, I will also discuss our other equipment choices and how we are going to kit this vehicle, but this video is only about the vehicle as such. Where I talk about standard equipment, etc., it will refer to the 2-liter bi-turbo Wildtrak 4x4 version. Previously, I owned the XLT version. This time around, it seems that Ford, in order to make a specific price point, removed a lot of equipment from the XLT, and once you've added that back, the price difference between an upgraded XLT and the Wildtrak was so small that it simply made sense to buy the Wildtrak. Also, one of the things that I specifically wanted, being the surround camera system, is only available on the Wildtrak. Although my wife is a very good driver, she does not like driving obstacles, and she also does not like to act as a spotter.
When there's one rock, I know where to put him. But when there are two or more, I clutch out completely.
So that's the main reason why I really wanted the surround camera system, to see if it's possible to eliminate the need for a spotter when we're alone. How suitable a vehicle is for your purpose obviously depends on the kind of overlanding you do. In our case, we like to go to very remote places for extended periods of time, and we often travel alone as a single vehicle. We have to be self-sufficient, so we have to be able to take along sufficient fuel, water, firewood, etc. We face a continuous struggle with space and weight. So for us, a pickup, known as a truck in the US and a ute in Australia and as a bakkie in our native South Africa, is the obvious choice, because we simply would not be able to pack enough into an SUV body style like this one. Also for us, a pickup is more versatile in that because we own horses, we have to be able to transport hay bales, horse feed, etc., and that is simply more convenient to do in a pickup than in an SUV. For overlanding, you need as much payload as you can get, and that is the main reason why the Ford Ranger Raptor, although a very nice off-road vehicle, is not really suitable for overlanding, because that very impressive suspension system comes at the cost of payload and towing capacity. The payload of the rest of the Ranger range is slightly above average for the class, and that obviously helps. Another factor that plays a role in our choices is that we do not have the luxury of dedicating a specific vehicle to overlanding, so it must also be suitable for use as transport on a daily basis. But even if you have the luxury of having a dedicated overland vehicle, you will find that a lot of the travel you do while overlanding is actually on-road rather than off-road. So how comfortable a vehicle is on-road is also a major factor to consider. I met a person on an overlanding trip who had a very, very capable vehicle, but it was so uncomfortable to drive on-road that he opted to pay somebody to take the vehicle for him to close to where he would go overlanding and then fly into the nearest airport. And that is not something that we can do. For on-road use, including bad gravel roads, the next generation Ranger really shines. I guess no vehicle is truly comfortable on corrugations or washboard as the Americans call it, but it seems that the Ranger is better than most. Judging by conversations with friends driving other brands after traversing the same section of road, it seems that their experience was significantly more uncomfortable than ours, and it cannot be just the case that we are tougher than they are. And in that regard, I can also say that the new generation one is an improvement on the older one. My wife says that she finds it to be more sure-footed and confidence-inspiring on gravel roads, although I must say that I actually found the previous generation to be quite good on gravel as well. Two tips that we have found useful is to let some air out of the tires on bad corrugations. If you air down your tires by around 10%, that certainly helps. And then a tip that I got from Andrews and Pierre White when I still had one of my Hiluxes is that the moment you go off a paved surface onto gravel, that you should put it into 4x4. And that really helps a lot for road holding. So ever since then, we tend to go into 4 high the moment we leave the tar. And an interesting aside is that some people claim that traveling in 4x4 also reduces damage to the road and track. In fact, the South African Parks Board in many of their parks specifically recommend that if you have 4x4 available, you should be traveling in 4x4 on all the gravel roads and tracks. For tires and rims, Ford made fairly reasonable choices for this generation Ranger. They resisted the trend towards larger rims and lower profile tires. So the Wildtrak comes standard with 18-inch rims and 255 65 profile tires, which are not so bad. What's also interesting is that you can order it from the factory with all-terrain tires should you want to, but the tire that they have selected is quite unknown in South Africa, and some of the American reviews that I read about it said that it's very susceptible to punctures. So I decided to go for the same tire that I had on my previous Ranger, and the local Ford dealer was very accommodating in that regard, in that they bought the factory fitted tires from me and I only had to pay in the difference with the tires I wanted. I wanted the Cooper Discoverer ST Max, but at the time they were not available in South Africa in 18-inch form. But luckily I had a full extra set of 17 rims from the previous generation Ranger, so I swapped that out and went for Cooper Discoverer ST Max in 265/70 R17, which worked out well because the circumference of those tires are almost identical to the factory fitted tires. What's also interesting and quite a strange decision, I think, from Ford's part, is that the spare wheel on the Wildtrak is actually a 17-inch higher profile tire. With the more aggressive tread pattern of the Coopers, there is more road noise, but definitely less than on the previous generation that I owned. So one of the characteristics of the next generation Ranger is that it is very quiet inside. I'm quite nervous about water crossings, so I'm very happy that the Rangers come with a class-leading wading depth of 800 millimeters. And this is a true wading depth with the breathing pipes etc. for diffs transfer cases etc. moved to above the wading depth limit. On many other makes, getting that done would require an aftermarket expense. So which of the features and gadgets are especially nice for overlanding? I find the surround cameras that automatically switch on when you're near an obstacle to be very, very useful. What I personally find extremely useful is that the built-in navigation of the South African Ranger includes Tracks for Africa maps and Tracks for Africa points of interest. You can see that the Tracks for Africa point of interest is marked with a little Tracks for Africa logo, and then if you click on that, you also get all of the information that you'll normally find on the Tracks for Africa app or the Tracks for Africa website relating to that point of interest. So I find this extremely useful. It's a real game changer because you've got a nice big screen for the navigation. You don't really need a separate Garmin GPS anymore unless you want to use that as a backup. The one downside is obviously because it's built-in navigation that you cannot plan a route and then upload the route to it, or if that is possible, I've not found a way how to do it yet. It has an onboard tire pressure monitoring system that shows the actual pressures, and it's very easy to reset the target pressure to your current pressures. It's also quite easy after you've rotated the tires to teach it again which sensor is with which tire. You just press and hold the OK button. It is also quite useful for people who want to add electrical accessories that it comes with a switch bank of 6 auxiliary switches that are pre-wired. This makes it quite easy to add things like light bars or winches and things like that. The tie-down points in the load bin that are rated to 400 kilograms. The fact that it comes standard with a removable tow hitch helps. A built-in 400 watt inverter, which is unfortunately not a pure sine wave inverter and is only 400 watt, but is very convenient for charging things like camera batteries. And then something that's a bit of a mixed bag is that there's a whole list of Ford-approved accessories that, if you fit them, are even covered by the Ford warranty. Unfortunately, most of these are ARB accessories, so in South Africa they are extremely expensive. A case in point is the long-range tank, whereas a normal South African auxiliary long-range tank will cost you in the region of about 10,000 Rand. The ARB replacement long-range tank is about 3 times that price. An often overlooked benefit is that it has got quite long service intervals at 15,000 kilometers, while some others in the class have service intervals of 10,000 kilometers. And a longer service interval makes it much easier to plan for services around your trips. It's got a fairly decent dealer network and service agent network throughout Africa, but obviously nowhere as near as good as Toyota's. Funnily enough, the radiator is now more accessible to clean, and I know that one uses a seed net, but in my experience, even with a seed net, a lot of seeds slip through into the radiator area, and then accessibility to remove them is quite convenient and important. Things that I find very nice, although not specifically for overlanding, is the adaptive cruise control, which can come in very useful on the way to and coming back from an overlanding trip. You can set the adaptive cruise control at a speed, in this case it's set at 76, and a following distance, and then if you get too close to the car in front, it will slow down automatically, it would brake automatically, it will even in stop and go traffic come to a full stop and then pull away again as the traffic starts moving again. Another safety feature that is quite nice is the rear cross-traffic alert. If you pull out of a parking bay or you reverse out of your driveway and there's a vehicle or a cyclist or a pedestrian approaching, it warns you of that fact. Then there are some things that are of dubious benefit. The first of these is the lane keeping assist system, which I've actually switched off. Then there's the hill descent control, which works very well and is quite intuitive to use, as you can change the speeds using the accelerator and brake pedals. But in practice, I hardly ever use hill descent control. Perhaps I'm a bit old school, but I tend to just put it into low range and then use the manual override on the gearbox to control the speed. It would be interesting if some of you could respond in the comments and say whether you find hill descent control very useful. This is my first vehicle with a terrain response system where you've got different driving modes for slippery and sand and mud and ruts that changes a number of the parameters of the vehicle. So I'm not used to that. I usually control things manually, switching on and off low range and 4x4 and the diff lock manually. What I've noticed that is quite interesting is if you put it in sand mode or in mud and ruts mode, a whole different set of gauges become available. For example, a gauge showing the temperature of the transmission fluid. On second thoughts, the driving modes can actually be handy and convenient. On the previous generation Ranger, Ford driver training recommended that you should switch off the traction control in sand. But doing so took quite a few seconds, and you had to redo it every time after you switched off the vehicle. Also in sand, ABS braking may actually be counterproductive. It seems that with the sand mode on the new Ranger, the traction control and the ABS responses are automatically reduced. If there is interest, I can make a special video delving deeper into the intricacies of the different driving modes. Please let me know in the comments if you are interested. Then there's some gimmicky stuff like a ruler on the tailgate and the clamps on the tailgate. I seriously doubt whether anybody would ever use that ruler for anything serious. There's the Ford Pass app with which you can start the vehicle remotely. Now in South Africa, I don't think anybody would be using that. And then there's keyless entry, which I actually don't like all that much. And in South Africa, there are a number of syndicates operating that have figured out how to use that to be able to steal vehicles. So that is something that I might actually switch off in due course. The Wildtrak comes with a drop-in bin liner, which is made of plastic. I would have much preferred the spray-in bin liner of the mid-range models. I think that is much more durable. So I had the plastic bin liner removed and a spray-in polyurethane bin liner applied. And then the list of things that I find totally useless, there was the sports hoop with which the Wildtrak came standard, but luckily the dealership was willing to buy that from me. And then there are some things that are worse on this Ranger than on the previous one I owned. First among these is that the cabin seems to have less interior space. On my previous one, there was a little cubbyhole on the right-hand side where we used to keep a notepad for making notes, writing down how much fuel we put in, etc. The center console was a dual-layer center console, while this is now a single layer, so it's not as easy to find things, and you can store less things in it. But the main issue is that there's now almost no space behind the rear seat, whereas in the previous version we kept a tire repair kit, a compressor, a bottle jack, the car's normal jack, warning triangles, a panga, which in other countries are called a machete. We were able to keep all that behind the rear seat, and now we have to find different spaces to store that. In practice, it is also much more difficult to fit an auxiliary fuel tank to the new model. On the old model, many people in South Africa fitted an auxiliary fuel tank above the spare wheel, which then dropped by about 50 millimeter and gave you about 60 liters extra of fuel. Now on the new Ford Ranger, there's a lot of additional chassis bracing running through that area, so it's not as easy to fit another fuel tank. The only local manufacturer that has already designed one resorted to using 3 different fuel tanks to put into the various nooks and crannies. So in practice, it would be easier to use the Ford approved long-range tank by ARB, which is a replacement tank. The only problem with that is that it costs 3 times as much as a typical auxiliary fuel tank. Perhaps small irritation is that the radio aerial on this one does not fold flat. It is removable, but then the reception is extremely bad. So it can unfortunately hook onto things, whereas with the previous model I could just fold the aerial flat. And then, although the new gear lever is aesthetically nice and quite easy to use, I much preferred the previous system where you shifted the whole gear lever across and then moved it forward and back to change gears in the manual mode. This system is much more finicky, where you first have to press the manual button, and then there's a minus button to shift down and a plus button to shift up. But it's not as easy to use, and I find it really difficult to use without looking where my finger is going. The previous system, you could keep your eyes on the road, and it was very easy to do by feel. Even with the smaller engine, it seems more responsive than the previous model, and the gearbox mapping seems to be spot on. It does have a lot more gadgets and electronics than the previous model, and as my dad would have said, those are just more things that can break. But we'll see. If you made it to this point in the video, I guess it means that you were never bored enough to do anything about it. So now I'm going to be bold enough to ask you for a favor. Please subscribe to the channel, as it will really help me to get to that magical number of 1,000 subscribers. Thank you for considering it.